Charlie, please take it away after switching on the timer.
Uh, My pleasure to introduce our next speaker, James O'Dwyer. James, please tell us about your living history.
Thank you, Charlie and Sri. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for both for inviting me and also for organizing this series. I think it's really important to record these histories, and it's also just exciting to hear other people's trajectories. So it's fun, and I think it's a really important thing to do. So I wasn't quite sure how deeply back in our living histories we should go, but I think from comments that Sri made earlier, I've got it okay to go right back to my early years. I grew up in Croydon. That is in South London. It's not a glamorous part of London, so it's not on many tourist guides, but I would say it's a very genuine, no nonsense kind of place. And I grew up there. My parents had immigrated from the Republic of Ireland and worked in the education sector and in information technology. And they moved to Croydon when I was 2. So I really spent my whole childhood from age of 2 up till I left and went to college. So it's a no nonsense town. I would say, hopefully, I was quite genuine, but probably full of nonsense at that time. And so I was interested in a lot of academic things. I was interested in math, in literature, storytelling. But I don't think at that point I had a really good barometer for the questions and ideas that I would ultimately really find interesting. And I think maybe like many of us, it took me a long time to get there. And I would not have imagined at that point in time what my future trajectory would have been. So I went from there to college in Durham, and I was still really quite indecisive at that point. And so we heard about universal anthropology in an earlier talk, and I remember in that weeks leading up to going to college, and even once I was there, they admitted me as a math major, and I was thinking about whether I should change to anthropology or a more broad-based natural sciences program. And in the end of week 1, I switched from math to physics. And I did stick with that. So I became a little bit more decisive and I stuck with physics for quite some time. From Durham, I had a lot of enjoyed being there, had a lot of fun. I was also fairly studious and really got into my studies while I was there. I moved then to Cambridge for graduate studies. And I should have mentioned, let's see, this is Durham Cathedral, so an ancient, very beautiful building. I didn't live there or anywhere really near there when I was in Durham, but I did actually live in this castle-like building up in the attic, just to the right of the gate here for a couple of years. And while I was there, I took what's called part 3 of the mathematical tripos. I think that is named after the third leg on an ancient kind of stool. Could be wrong about that. And I followed that with a PhD in the Department of Applied Math and Theoretical Physics. And what I worked on there was on theory related to phase transitions. And I would say this was the first point I could look back on and say this was a kind of intellectual thrill, or something that really I could say this is a question that I find truly interesting. And what fascinated me about this is, so I have a picture of representing a liquid gas transition on the left here. So at a phase transition, you may have dependent variables like the density of that substance, which is changing, and then parameters, in this case temperature, which are controlling that change in density. And the beauty for me of phase transitions was that 2 things. One is the behavior of density, or the variable you're interested in near to a phase transition, is predictable and it typically changes as a power law function of the control parameter, like temperature. And the other thing is, it's not only predictable or falls into that kind of functional form, but there's a relatively, or maybe a surprisingly small range of exponents for those power laws, with many different microscopic systems falling into the same universality classes. And so that was something to me that it was just hard to have, wasn't something I would have expected. So it was a kind of degree of intellectual surprise for me in finding that out, and I was excited to work on that. So what happened next? Well, I would say during my PhD, I really loved that overall intellectual picture, but I also loved the puzzles and the calculations I was doing. So you can all get excited about this. Not many people have read my PhD thesis, at least as far as I'm aware, but I pulled it up and pulled out a section for you here. So here's an example. This is a second order correction in the framework we're using for a particular exponent, i.e. the exponent of those power laws I mentioned. And you can see this in my text here. While this expression is somewhat complicated, it can be simplified. And that's the kind of thing I went on to do, was to simplify, to both generate expressions like these and then try to simplify them. So I had fun with that. And I love this intellectual picture about phase transitions and this universality. But I didn't really feel I was contributing usefully to a bigger picture. I felt that that general framework was somewhat well understood. That's how I felt at the time anyway. And so I didn't feel like there were big enough open questions. And so I was looking to shift into a different area. So that led me to thinking about people who had moved from physics to biology. And I happened to be near to where John Hart was based. So John Hart fits that phenotype, a former physicist who'd been working for a long time in ecology at UC Berkeley. And I bugged him for a couple of weeks and tried to understand maybe how the tools I had learned in physics could be applicable in modeling in ecology. And it must not have annoyed him too much. He recommended me for a postdoc to Jessica Green, who was my postdoc mentor. And I moved to Eugene, Oregon. And she was looking for somebody who would have a skill set to work in quantitative questions in microbial ecology. And so this really was a pin on a map for me, not somewhere I was familiar with. So everything really changed. I moved from Cambridge to Eugene, from applied math department to an ecology and evolution center. And of course, the research questions were now totally different. So it was a huge adventure, a lot of uncertainty, and but really fun. Exciting. I learned a lot. From there, I moved as a research fellow to the Santa Fe Institute. And I continued to learn ecology, but also broadened that knowledge base and thought a lot about other kinds of complex systems. And I remember over the first lunchtime there finding that someone who worked in anthropology was looking at very similar kinds of patterns to what I had been looking at in ecology. And that, again, was another intellectual thrill for me, finding that there were commonalities, not just in ecological systems or between different ecological systems, but in completely different complex systems. And so those lessons have stuck with me, and collaborations with people I met there and visits back there, and still now. So yeah, it was a great place to be. But I will be honest and say that I've been a postdoc in Eugene and then worked in this complex systems center. I had so much biology left to learn. And so one thing that stuck with me is that what worked for me, I've been now 12 years in the Department of Plant Biology at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And what worked for me, what still does work for me, is being immersed in biology, teaching biology, having my colleagues down the corridor be biologists, the seminar series I go to, all of that. And so that being in that world has really helped me to both learn more biology and has also shaped my research questions. I was lucky enough that, despite it sounded like a very specific department, plant biology, my colleagues think very broadly. And even though there was no one else really quite like me in the department, they were excited to hire me and then to let me work on what I wanted to work on. So I'll just summarize our most recent work and then finish up with a few lessons that I think I've learned maybe could be useful to people watching. So a couple of our recent papers exemplify where I've got to. And one lesson, I guess, is things I thought when I spoke with John Hart about applying statistical physics methods in biology, things I thought might be somewhat straightforward. It really might have taken me 15 plus years to find the right way to formulate those questions. So these are some recent papers. and all led, by the way, by excellent trainees in my group. So Srividya Iyer and Kenneth Drops, who are graduate students, and Ashish George, who's a former postdoc. This is a recent paper looking at predicting microbial community function, a very difficult problem. We've also looked recently at the role of life history in plant community coexistence and the maintenance of biodiversity. And this influence of looking at universality across many different kinds of complex systems, that has stuck with me as well. And so we've continued to work on that. And this paper, published with Ashish, looked at commonalities between microbial communities, plant communities, and patterns of employment in US cities. So thinking about lessons, a couple of scientific lessons have stuck with me. And these are just things that work for me, or that I, kind of trying to distill what I've been interested in. One is my first many papers in ecology were mostly what you would call pure theory papers. So developing mathematical results or simulations relating to ideas that were out there, or questions that were out there, but mostly theoretical. And then more recently, I would say for the last several years, my papers have almost all interfaced with some kind of experimental or field data. And so I still think theory in ecology is very cool, but one lesson is that the coolest theory is theory that you can show applies to the real world. The second thing I would say I've landed on in terms of how I approach science is that some of this work, the recent work, is about finding a new framework to analyze existing data. And that's been fruitful for our group, a way to think about doing theory in ecology. And the other is about bringing different types of data together. So the life history work is about combining life history and stochastic competition for resources in a new way, and then building the analysis that combination of things needs. And I guess the third thing, maybe relating a bit to this paper in front of me now, but to some of our other work too, is that I like to ground our theory development in specific concrete examples, but then to look for potential for generalizing, for areas where those specific results can be generalized further. So that's that influence of universality from my physics degree, but also perhaps from the Santa Fe Institute, etc. But I really like to start grounded. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I know I'm a little over time. A couple of lessons that maybe are a bit more general than those specific scientific lessons. So one is, obviously no one's path is going to be like any other, because somebody who's at an earlier career stage now is facing a very different landscape than what I did. And so one thing I hope will still be relevant is I always found it so hard to work on something that I felt I should work on, that was the sensible thing to work on. I was much less productive. Whereas I was always much more productive working on something that I'm passionate about. So I've generally followed that passion and then tried to be as sensible as I can about picking up the right tools and knowledge base along the way as I went. And the last thing I want to mention is what I'm sort of cheekily calling the O'Dwyer rule of three here, and that is, I think many people go through a career, maybe it's in a physics department or a chemistry department, and they kind of continue on a very smooth line and are very productive and successful. And in a way, looking back on that, and shifting from physics to ecology, it was not a path of least resistance. It required some thought. And so I felt like I couldn't just proceed and just let things happen. I had to have a rule for assessing whether things were actually going well. And so here's what I came up with. This is way back when I made that transition. It was a sort of 3 scale, are things going well? So first of all, am I enjoying what I do day to day? And so back then, when I made the transition, that would be things like, am I still doing fun calculations like I had been doing? And now, of course, that's very, I still like to do that too, but it's broader. So it can be, am I enjoying the mentoring I'm doing and the teaching and the service, etc. So the day-to-day work. Second was, is this making impact among my peers in the field? And that was very important to me when I was making that transition, because I just felt there was no point in doing it if people found the work boring, or somebody else would have just done it the very next day. And so I wanted to be able to make an impact, do something a little creative and different that my peers would appreciate. And the third level was even broader. Could I explain and justify why I'm working on what I'm working on to a broader, even societal audience? Very much impossible to satisfy all three of those criteria at any one time. So my general working hypothesis was, if I can, on average, satisfy 2 out of 3, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. All right, thank you very much. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you for a great talk, James, and I'm applauding on behalf of the audience. We have, let's see, I'll start with the first question. How do you incorporate the diversity of microbial species in your models to go beyond common model organisms like E. coli?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what led me to some of the recent projects in microbial ecology and led our group to thinking about them was microbial communities in nature tend to be very diverse. And something else I've worked on and thought a bit about is how we even should appropriately define microbial species and taxa. That's a big question. But even if you kind of go with one of the working definitions, it's quite typical that a microbial community might have several hundreds of species. And so the data is out there, so we can document that in natural systems. Modeling that is extremely challenging. And so the traditional modeling approaches in ecology often have been based on pairwise interactions between species or uptake of resources by multiple species. It's not that those aren't in some ways relevant, although I think they're probably not the whole story about how we should approach modeling microbial systems. But certainly, even for those models, they become very highly parameterized for real microbial systems. So I'm not sure I have found a solution to that, but I would say in our most recent work, we've tried to rethink those frameworks in order to be able to handle and still make predictions for very diverse communities, which we were finding very hard when we were trying to parameterize more traditional ODE-based models. So I'm not sure I have a solution, but that's how we have approached it.
Great, thank you. And we have another question. So among the 3 questions that you have up on the slide right now, these lessons learned, when you find that the answer to one of those is no, what do you do?
That's a great question. So I think I've always been, it's not like every minute of every day, but I've taken time to reflect on these 3 questions through that whole time as I shifted into ecology, which was in 2007, a long time ago now. So I think there's 2 answers to that. One is I've always tried to adjust. So if I feel like I'm really low on the enjoyment of what I'm doing day to day, I try to adjust that. And same with the other questions. That is there, are my reviews coming back where people are like, oh, it's another paper by O'Dwyer, it's a little boring? Well, if I got that sense, that would make me think, oh, maybe I need to adjust that a little bit or identify a new potential collaboration. There's so many things that can spark a new idea if you're open to it. And we heard that from some of the other speakers that, something like that would make me think, you know what, maybe I need to kind of revisit one of my colleagues from earlier on and say, well, maybe there's something we could work on, and that might become more interesting. And even with the third question, that has led me to think about more translational questions over time, adjusting that. So that's one answer, is there's I think a constant adjustment. And the other answer is, if one of these isn't going so well, I'm kind of okay with that. If I feel like 2 out of 3 on average are doing all right, I can go with that for a while. If I felt 2 out of 3 of these I was completely failing on, that would be a red flag. And if I felt that, honestly, making that transition into a new field that I was really just, not meeting, even 2 of these criteria, or that would have given me second thoughts about making the transition. And so, one not going so well, I think it's okay. 2 is a red flag. If I wasn't getting any of these 3 right at any point, I would probably think about doing something a bit different.
Thank you. And thank you again, James.
Thank you.